I'm Yulia, and this is Red Lines, a show where we dive into some daring subjects and cross red lines of political speak. Today we're going to be talking about what does the future hold for Ukraine, more specifically 2025, with the shift of power in the United States and worldwide. And we have a brilliant panel of four people today to discuss it with: Greg Terry, Jonathan Fink, and Professor Gerdes.
So I'm delighted to be able to join this. It's Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain podcast. I am also delighted that I know all the people on the panel today. So I think I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
My name is Gerdes. I'm just a professor trying to provide context in the war in Ukraine so people understand what's really going on.
And my name is Greg Terry, a part of the Greg Terry Experience, working in Ukraine now, getting ready to start my 27th year. And it's my honor to be here with Yulia and also with Jonathan and Professor Gerdes. Consider all of you my friends.
Awesome. Well, it's really good to see all of you today. I think our viewers are going to be surprised that there are so many of us today, which is kind of a happy coincidence. And we're going to be discussing the peace talks and I guess the possibility of peace in Ukraine once Trump becomes president on January 20th. The most recent statement that we kind of have gotten from his team is that Trump has recently realized that it's going to be a lot harder to end the war in Ukraine than he thought, and it's clearly not going to take 24 hours. So, what are your guys' thoughts on this?
Jonathan, you want to start?
I'll jump in my perspective. Yeah, I'll jump in my perspective. It has seemed to me right from the start here, when it became apparent that Kiev was not going to fall in 3 days or a week or 2 weeks or whatever it was, and that Russia was going to find it considerably more difficult. I think escalation management has had this very much in mind. Prevent World War III, prevent some kind of nuclear response by Russia. And of course, Russia has used that nuclear threat over and over again. But I think the third pillar of why Ukraine has not been supported for an outright victory is very much this, and this is very much thinking, I think, in Berlin and even in Washington and Biden. And that has been, look, this will all lead to a negotiation eventually. All wars end in negotiation. Well, that's factually untrue because some wars don't. They lead to frozen conflicts like North and South Korea, for instance. Germany did not necessarily surrender in this formal sense. It capitulated because it was beaten into a hole in the ground. So there's that sort of misconception. But I think the idea has been all along that, you know, whether you want both sides to attrit each other or not, you're going to hold out because you don't want to sort of spoil the chances of a negotiation. And I think this is still the mantra you hear behind closed doors with many, many people. They might bemoan Russia's brutality. They might bemoan the genocidal character of the war. They might talk about how many, treaties Russia's violated. But ultimately, they're still putting store in the idea that negotiation is possible. Before I hand over to the other two guys, I don't think it is possible. I don't think a steady, secure, long-term negotiation with Putin is a thing. It simply doesn't exist. Everything is contingent on how powerful he feels. But that does not seem to be the trend behind closed doors of the apparatchiks and our political lords and masters. In that, I suspect Trump may well be hearing these same kind of voices talking to him about the possibilities of negotiation.
So I'll chime in and say Trump never speaks for precision. So if he says, I am going to have a peace deal in the first 24 hours, he doesn't mean it. He means he's going to do this thing and maybe sometime it'll happen. It's like, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it. It's just say he speaks for this effect all the time. He never does that. Okay. So now I think also is realizing through people that are around him, like Michael Waltz, for example, who's a Green Beret replacing Jake Sullivan, the lawyer, that this isn't exactly what you think it is. And he's realizing we need a lasting peace that's not going to come back and backfire and bite us and make you look terrible. And that's the kind of message that Trump will receive, I think. So that's my quick 2 cents. Greg, go ahead.
Well, I would just jump in and say, agreeing actually with both of you, with Jonathan and with you, Dr. Gerdes, and that is, I see no negotiations in the future. I see no lasting peace in the near-term future. And one of the reasons why I believe that Trump is slow to understand this is the reason that many Americans are slow to understand it, and then even many others around the world. And that is the mindset of the Kremlin and the mindset of Vladimir Putin and his cronies there are really difficult for Western thinkers to understand.
Mhm.
I stand by my reasoning that Vladimir Putin is not campaigning for another election. We can talk about the escalation of North Korean troops that are in and now confirmed fighting according on the front there in Kursk. They've been spotted in the other regions. Kim Jong-un himself is not worried about a re-election. Donald Trump has just been elected president of the United States. He is focused not only on foreign policy, but domestic policy as well. I agree completely with Professor Gerdes. He speaks these grandiose ideas to shock people, but then time begins to unfold and we see the reality of what happens. I personally feel that, especially the American viewpoint, they really do not understand this Soviet evil mindset of Vladimir Putin. And due to that, I don't see this lasting, just, strong, fair peace that Volodymyr Zelensky talks about, a just peace, a secure peace. I don't see that anywhere on the horizon.
Unpack that mindset, Greg.
The mindset is simple, and Jonathan can speak to this as well. He speaks Russian as well. Yulia, of course, with her background as a Ukrainian, understands this concept. They are in it for the long haul. Vladimir Putin is over 70 years old, and the mindset of propaganda, the mindset of control, the mindset of destabilization, global destabilization, is not something new. We're witnessing what is happening in Syria right now, the fall of Syria, the implosion of Syria, a major effect on that Russian world. We heard out of the mouth of Vladimir Putin, I can't tell you the exact date, but at least a year ago when he was meeting with Xi Jinping, and they were basically stating it is time for a new world order. We have a divide, we have a break. It is not time now for the West to control the narrative, whether it's economics, currency, military, alignments, you name it. So that mindset really been around since the 50s with this destabilization that's been happening throughout the United States and Europe. And we are now catching up to understanding that there has been a long game at play here. And when you have a long game at play, a short game will never win it. And you think about Russia, and many times when you think about Russians, you think about good chess players. I think about Garry Kasparov. I think about all these other guys who are known for their chess play. The best chess players are long-term players. They're looking ahead, not 3, 5, 7, 9. They're looking ahead 10, 12, 14 moves, and they are analyzing the long term. Here, as an American, I understand it. We like the shock value. I want the 3 moves. I want to hammer, and we have victory. Yay! And wave my flag. But the reality is that mindset of Russia and Vladimir Putin is very long term. And I believe now just the West is just now waking up to that.
And I think to jump
Um,
in with the mindset question there, I mean, there's the political aspect you've talked about there, absolutely true. The other one is just the system of values. And they are the very antithesis of liberal values. They're the very antithesis of conservative values as well. And that is that you will not have any agency. You will be, you'll have deference to authority. Whether that authority gives you moral or immoral instructions is neither here nor there. You will carry out those instructions. You will not resist, you will not organize, you will not express yourself, you will not organize in a political way, you will even not organize in any kind of religious or dissenting way. You will not even think for yourself in a economic, political, social, or religious context. This is the absolute antithesis, I think, of what most people indeed who voted for Trump think, and the things that if you ask them, what do they actually value about the society that created them and molded them? Somehow, though, Vladimir Putin has been able to convince a great many people either not to care or that somehow he is like them and that he stands for the same set of values. It's absolutely not the case. This Soviet mindset does not have morality. It does not have Christian belief. It does not have any of these things, freedom of expression, freedom of organization, freedom to gain wealth and retain that wealth and pass that wealth to your children. None of this stuff works in Russia. And this is largely down to the inherited Soviet mindset.
Prof, before I throw it back to you or to Yulia, I just have to speak to what Jonathan just said. I just watched Vladimir Putin's speech in front of his end of the year defensive meeting. I'll be talking about that on a video upcoming. And Jonathan, this is exactly what he said. He said, quote, "We are the only true Christians. They are not Christians."
Yeah.
And I mean, rows of applause, that mindset is so crazy. And then of course we could even talk about the value of life and the sanctity of life. It just goes on and on and on. So
But he uses the same words. He uses the same words in order to convince the West that we're the same. But your average Christian in the United States that you see in church on Sunday that's trying to be nice to their neighbors and love your neighbor as yours, that's not what they're doing in Russia. It's very, very different. So we use the same language and confound it. And he's been masterful at that. Nevertheless, there was a poll Representative Don Bacon just put out that showed, this is the Reagan Defense Forum, that showed that 75% of Americans consider Ukraine our ally, while 80% consider Russia our enemy. This just came out, like I saw this 3 hours ago, right? So the American mindset is still very much Russia. You might have. Wait a minute. So there's not, like, even in MAGA land, it's not that Russia is great. It's, wait a minute, we should we be involved in that? It's not like, so I drive around and I see Ukrainian flags on cars and flying from a house or in a shop or something. I've never seen a Russian flag on a car, on a house, on a shop, on anything. It just doesn't, you just don't see that. So there's not a pro-Russian, there's a message that Russia has been able to inculcate that is like, why should we care? If that's not our fight, we shouldn't be involved in that. We have problems here. That's the message that they've gone across. And it's been fairly effective in contaminating a portion of the population.
Yeah, well, I do want to. So there's so many things that I want to comment on. One being the most recent is you don't see Russian flags, but I do see quite a few hippies and hipsters wearing hammers and sickles on their totes, not knowing what that represents because they think it's cool and vintage. So we do have that, and we have some tankies and commies, but yeah, there's no one like actively supporting modern day Russia. There are people that for some reason think that the world was better when the Soviet Union was around because they're just miseducated.
Yeah.
As to coming back to Trump and sort of like how he sees this and the fact that he's realizing that maybe there is more to this conflict, I think that when Trump was saying these things, I don't necessarily think they were for shock value. I think that he sort of thought that ending this war is as simple as giving Zelensky an ultimatum and basically talking to Putin about this. I think that he's now realizing that there is a lot more to Ukraine than just giving Zelensky an ultimatum, and that's not as easy as he thinks it is because he can give us as many ultimatums as he wants, but ultimately it's not up to him, right? Ultimately, it's up to Zelensky and up to the Ukrainian people. I also think he's now realizing Trump has this sort of downside to him is that he's very egotistic, and I think he thinks that his position on the world stage is a lot stronger than it actually is. Like, I believe that he genuinely thought that Putin would be listening to him and that Putin cares about what Trump has to say. And I think he's very quickly realizing that Putin doesn't care what Trump has to say, nor does he listen to him, nor does he take him seriously because he doesn't take anyone seriously.
But that's great. I mean, that's actually awesome. That if the more Putin, okay, so if you watch the dynamics at play here, it's been wonderful for Ukraine. Zelensky has been saying, yes, Trump, this is good. We want peace. We just want a just peace, and we need your help to achieve this just peace. At the same time, the Russians have been just like trying to poke Trump in the eye. Who does he think he is trying to explain to us? You're going to see what happens when we blow up, right? I mean, that's the approach that the Russians have been largely taking here. I'm just like, guys, this was like the wrong approach, but I don't want to tell them that. So they've been taking precisely the wrong approach. As to your first point, though, about the idea that it's not this, it's that, I think it's both. I think he is always talking for effect, and he also thought it was going to be easier. And part of that thought he's going to be easier is because he really values that personal relationship that he had with Putin. You get this out of if you read Stent's book on Putin's world. Like, he really valued that personal relationship, and he's all about personal relationships. But that's not going to carry him very far at all.
Well,
so we're going to see
to your
reality.
point there, before I throw it to Jonathan to respond to Yuli and to you, over the weekend, we've seen where now Viktor Orban is trying to be used as the mediator, the one who is Putin's buddy, the one who is Trump's buddy. But what most do not understand, it was instant that Kyiv said, if Orban is involved, we will not be involved. We have no absolute avenue of communication with Viktor Orban or Hungary. So these little pokes and prods, as you call them, Professor Gerdes, with Trump, I'm sorry about that, Professor Gerdes, that Trump is doing, they're just going to backfire because Yulia, there you go. Yulia, you are 100% correct. We're at the point now, you're not going to tell Zelensky or Ukraine what to do. They're fighting for their very lives. And, you can look for peace. I'm working on a piece right now about peace. And until you see Zelensky at a table communicating directly with Russia and whoever the mediator is, there's nothing to even talk about. We are fighting for the freedom. We're fighting for the future of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that I think that because of the ego, right? Like Trump underestimated a little bit what the job entails in terms of Ukraine and Russia. First of all, he underestimated how much Russia doesn't care about him and how much Russia doesn't care about anything at this point. And he also underestimated how much Ukraine stands our own ground. Because to be fair, in the MAGA circles, right, like the idea of Ukraine is sort of like, oh, you're just begging for money, and like, your cocaine addicted president comes here for handouts, but that's not what happens. And that's not how Ukraine has recommended itself in the world. And it's like, if we had better news coverage or better education, most of these people who say that would know that. But that's also sort of like the realm in which Trump exists, right? Because let's be realistic, like he only starts thinking about politics and like immersing himself in politics when once he's actually in office. He doesn't necessarily pay attention to world conflicts or what's happening while he's running, right? Because I think we can all agree that Trump is not running to make America better again. He's running because he wants to be president, because that's kind of like an ego thing. And
I mean, this is one of the interesting quotes from one of the inner circle at Mar-a-Lago that came out last week. During the election, and I think some of us, all of us, fell into this. I fell into this as well, which is like Trump thinks this, Trump thinks that, Trump's going to do this, Trump's not going to do that. In reality, this aide just sort of let slip that not only has not really made his mind up, he's still consulting, but he hasn't put much thought to it. He hasn't given it much thought yet. So everyone that is putting, their framework onto it, their hopes, their fears, the likelihood is he probably parked it in the part of his brain like, this is simple. Biden's an idiot, right? He couldn't solve it, but that's because he's an idiot. I can sort this in 5 minutes. I won't really think about it until I have to. I suspect it's as simple as that.
So he has no ideological center, right? Like if you ask someone like Rubio is a hardened anti-communist with, I think, parents from Cuba or something like that. He will never not see communism as something bad. Like that's right. His Secretary of State pick. Okay. Now, even if he's talking something kind of MAGA-ish about we got to put America first, he still has a hardened center. Trump does not. He has no ideological center. That's why I've called him a wild card again and again. He could go this way or he could go that way. It just depends on who's around him, advising him, directing him the right direction. So that's why Waltz is such a huge pick, and that's why Gabbard would be so terrible.
And I think also, Jonathan, to your point, and also to Professor Gerdes' point, I just don't think in the reality, right this very moment, that Ukraine honestly is not a priority for him. I really believe it's for him. It's a big issue for people. It is an important issue for the world. But for Donald Trump and his circle and moving into the early part of 2025, it's definitely not on the front burner. It is on the back burner. We'll deal with it. We'll fix it. But I have other issues I'm focusing on. I just think that's some of the compartmentalization in his mindset that the world is beginning to recognize now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with most of it. I think that it's not sort of, I mean, see, the way that I see Trump is probably like the most aggressively negative out of all of you. Is I don't think he thinks about these things until he has to think about these things, not because he has other priorities, but because he just doesn't necessarily think about these things. Like, I personally don't think he's running for president or becoming president because he actually has all of these ideas on how to make his country or geopolitical issues better. I think he's running for president because it's cool to be president. You know, like I don't see any sort of I don't see any sort of um it's like the lights are on but no one's home, you know. I don't think he cares about any of these political issues. I don't think he actually cares about the border. I don't think he actually cares about the economy. I don't think he actually cares about Ukraine. I think it's just more of
He
like,
does care about staying out of jail, though, and this is, I
yes,
think, a
exactly.
very important and underrated thing, you know? I mean,
Exactly.
he
Yeah,
will have a huge amount of power over the DOJ, the justice process, and I think it's less likely that anyone's gonna move further criminal convictions against him. So I think a huge motivation would be to spend the rest of his life in a fair degree of luxury, in the limelight, and, you know, not in an orange jumpsuit. That's a big motivator.
exactly. That
I think he does. I think it is not fair to say that he doesn't care. I think let's say both simultaneously he can care about things, and he's also an egoist who prioritizes himself over these other things. But he does, I think, genuinely care. But to Greg's point, I think it's like so. When we went back to on election day, I was showing how like where foreign policy was, people who voted. I'm like with that foreign policy crowd, right? You're like 14th on the list of priorities. So that's the way he's going to interpret this, because all these domestic issues are going to displace that. And so it'll take a while to even get around to it. And once you do, you're kind of dealing with the B team as far as what your priorities are, how it's concerned. So he's an egoist. Everybody here agrees. He could also simultaneously care. I don't know that he doesn't, but he cares about himself a lot more than everything else. Everybody agrees, but it's going to be deprioritized compared to other issues. So that also seems to give extra indication that it's not going to be solved right away.
Well, yeah, it's not going to be solved. Well, I think we all agree that it's not going to be solved right away either way. I think that I personally think that it's just sort of, yeah, you're very right when people when you were talking about how people say, oh, Trump is going to do this, Trump is going to do that. We don't know what he's going to do because he like doesn't think about it, and I don't think he's going to know what he's going to do until until the question is right in front of him and he has to make a decision left or a decision right or a decision center, right? You're correct that it's going to be deprioritized. I just, I mean, I agree with like 99% of everything that's said here. It's just that I disagree with the motivations in his. I disagree with the core motivation behind him doing these things and behind him prioritizing what he's prioritizing, because I think that he's like a child where like his aides come to him and tell him this needs to be dealt with because this is going to be bad for your ratings, or this is what like people are, I don't know, protesting against or something like that, and that's when he's going to deal with it. Because in reality, I don't think he actually wants to be in that seat, and I don't think he wants to make these decisions. He just wants to not be in jail and kind of like, you know, be president, but without having to actually think about these things. So I don't I honestly am scared for this presidency, not even because like, not even for the reasons that people are saying, because like he could flush Ukraine or make a deal with Russia. I'm scared for this presidency because the way that he is mapping out the things that he wants to do to the economy of the United States might go into a deep, deep crisis, also plunging the world into a deep, deep crisis. And that's where I'm scared, because at that point, it doesn't matter if he's allied with us or with Russia. Like if there is a world crisis exacerbated by America economically, then it's going to be all really bad, no matter what, no matter what sort of like, you know, defense solutions he comes up with. I hope that makes sense of what I'm trying to kind of explain here, of what my worries
I mean,
are.
he's not probably going to do a huge amount of decision making himself. He will defer a lot of
Mhm.
that to the people he
That's right.
picks, um, and rely on their, you know, their judgment. He'll probably spend a decent part of his term on the golf course, which is, of course, what he did the first time round, as well as you know, tending to his image and all this kind of stuff, doing the superficial, symbolic stuff. Which actually is probably not a million miles from other politicians. I mean, a lot of some politicians will you know, have incredibly intense activity in office. Others will defer more stuff down to their aides. He'll probably be on that sort of an extreme spectrum of doing that. So the picks, as Dr. Geddes says, are incredibly important, and it's not as bad. I mean, it's a mixed bag, and there's some real stinkers there. Kash Patel, awful, vile, empty vessel of a human, absolutely dreadful. And clearly as drunk deeply of Russian propaganda. Elon Musk, extremely disturbing individual. Extremely disturbing individual. Let's park his engineering and capitalistic prowess, such as it is. Very, very disturbing influence indeed. And then there's Tulsi Gabbard, which has been mentioned. But you have Keith Kellogg. You have some really interesting picks. They're the ones specifically tasked with Ukraine. The sort of stronger of the picks are the ones who are going to be actually deferred down to and asked, okay, we need this fixed. How are you going to do it? And they may well come back to Trump with some interesting answers, such as, okay, Putin's accelerating. He's not decelerating, right? What do you do with this? Well, okay, you give Ukraine everything they need to give him a good slap. And that may be the only thing that gets him to the negotiating table. He may want to crash oil prices. What's the surest way of destroying Putin? It's probably not actually through arms at all. It's through crashing the Russian economy and dropping the price of oil.
So to
Yeah,
that
I
point
completely
oh,
agree with that, and I
yeah.
know, Prof, you want to talk about that one. I I can't agree more. I'm an American. I'm 52 years old, and it's not just the president that runs the country. It's that cabinet. It's those that are around him. And Jonathan, as you just stated, I think there are some good picks there, and there are some dreadful picks, as you would have said there with that Queen's English. And we have to be patient right now. And we hate to be patient. We're humans by nature. We want an answer right now. We want to see the end before the beginning begins. But you are so correct, sir. The destruction of Russia will happen probably not first on the battlefield, but it will happen first inside the Russian economy, the destabilization of that system. And I call it a regime. It must be imploded. The economic, forget the sanctions, the economic factors of oil. We know that Russia just struck the largest oil deal in the history of the world with India, that many barrels of oil going a day. So we can see and to be quite honest, this is the type of game when you speak about a Trump, and as Julia, and Jonathan, you were both saying, he wants to stay out of jail, he wants to do this, or he'll be on the golf course. All of those most likely are very true. I agree with you, but at the same time, he also wants to leave his legacy. And
That's
when
right.
you talk about the legacy, forget the name of it. It could be Ronald Reagan, it could be Woodrow Wilson, it doesn't matter. The legacy that that person wants to leave, I hope there's enough understanding to use the players that he has assembled around him, because in regard to Ukraine, there are 2 or 3 good ones there that I believe know the score. And what better legacy to leave than, I imploded the Soviet Union, and I call it the Soviet Union, even though that fell. That fell. But the reality is, there's much, much more at play here than just one person. And there is a team, and I do believe that good defeats evil and light defeats darkness, and a little bit of patience here. And it's brutal on the front. It's hellish on the front. Just talking to a soldier last night, horrible, but the guys are fighting, they're standing for what is right, and a little bit of patience here. I'm optimistic going into 2025, to be quite honest with you guys.
So Jonathan, he just talked about the Queen's English. I have a serious question for you. Does that become the King's English now? Do you change that when with a different, or is it always the Queen's English?
And what do I call it as a committed Republican in terms of monarchy? Yeah.
Okay, so
Um,
back to an actual point here. So what Trump could do with oil and what he plans to do with oil and drilling and natural gas and that kind of thing, I think that'll be very healthy for the economy, and that'll bring prices potentially down. And it can't just work in the US, it's a global economy, so that will affect things worldwide, which would be bad for Putin. The thing that he could do that Yulia's worried about would be things like tariffs, because tariffs could have a terrible effect on our economy. And again, he has no political center, and so sure, let's have 100% tariff if you're going to do that. But he's just crazy enough that he might think that that's a good idea. So hopefully his cabinet will rein him in and keep him from running off that kind of cliff.
Well,
So
I
you're right, Julia, that could be a problem.
Can I add something that actually contributes to all of these problems that I think that no one thinks about is the ban of TikTok, which actually like brings billions and billions of dollars to the American economy every year, and also 50% of businesses that exist in America today wouldn't exist and will not exist if TikTok is banned because they only got their platform and started making money through TikTok. So I think that this idea, like, and I know that the Biden signed it. I know that it's a bipartisan situation, and but if he and his cabinet somehow don't save that, I think that we're going to have a much more a bigger economic issue in our hands than just tariffs, because I don't think that American senators and representatives and judges and whatever understand how much impact this app has on the economy of America as a country.
I'm
So
not
I
sure
think there
anybody.
is a
I'm not
lot.
sure the long game is to ban it. I think the long game is to try to own it. I think
Yeah,
that's. I
but
think
if
that's
they
the play.
yeah, but the thing is, if they don't sell and they're not, and it doesn't look like they're planning on selling, then it's gonna go away on January 19th.
Yeah, well, maybe they'll create Truth TikTok or Twitter TikTok or some
Yeah.
variation. Anyway, back to what Greg was just talking about. So I just finished reading Gabbard's book. I did read through the whole thing, and what struck me about that was not just the talking points about the Russian talking points that you normally hear, but that it's Gabbard's pick is not about Russia. Gabbard's pick is about all the other ways that she's aligned with Trump's narrative and the MAGA kind of perspective. And it just happens to be an extra bonus icing on the cake that she's where she is. I don't know whether she'll be confirmed by the Senate or not, but I'm convinced now after having read the book that it's not just about that particular. Like we tend to look so narrowly, that all of us in here at Ukraine, that we have to kind of expand the aperture sometimes and think like there's more at play here. And I'm not saying that she's a good pick either. I'm just saying that I think I understand it a little differently. And then you were talking about legacy. Trump's legacy, right? So Biden wants to have a legacy too. And I think he thinks that his legacy is, I kept us out of World War III and there were no nukes. There was not, right? I mean, I think that's what he's thought about. This is where Schultz is right now. Schultz, I don't know if the no confidence vote actually went through yet by the time that as we're taping this. But he's doubling down on no tourists, and his legacy, he thinks it's going to be, I had measured support for Ukraine that didn't escalate into World War III. I think both Schultz and Biden are in that exact same spot. So these presidents and prime ministers and things like that, they think about that legacy, and that's a very powerful motivator for all of them.
Yeah, they do. I
It
agree with
is.
that
It is.
wholeheartedly.
And
I think that they don't think about it as I think that they think that the policy of de-escalation is what's going to prevent World War III, but in reality, it's the policy of escalation and like not letting Russia escalate is what's going to prevent World War III. I also wanted to before I pass it to Jonathan, I wanted to comment on something that was said earlier about Trump and sort of like patience. I think Greg said it. Everyone said it. Like I don't think a lot of people are worried that like Trump is going to come to the to office, especially before like I guess he appointed his certain picks, right? That he's going to come into the office and he's just going to flush Ukraine, and it's going to be like a drastic thing. Like I don't think anything drastic is going to be happening for a very long time. Yeah, I agree with the patience virtue, because it's like by the time he gets to Ukraine, I think that at that point we won't necessarily need the United States as much as we need it today, because we are already sort of shifting our not alliances, but shifting our dependence on Europe and on other countries. And I personally am not worried that it's like he comes to office a couple of months past, like he cuts off aid and all of this starts happening. He can't afford to cut off aid because he can't afford to piss off American defense companies. And they're making a lot of money right now. And if we know anything, is that Trump loves billionaires and billionaires love Trump in that sort of
well, this is the
capacity. So I
interesting
don't.
positioning. Like, I talked about this one earlier. I mean, this is really interesting positioning because, first of all, as you say, there's a lot of stuff that Biden is finally sending across. Now, that's slow and it's taking time to get there, but it will be in the machine once Trump comes in. So you'll probably have already an uplift in munitions, and that will carry on. There's a delayed mechanism that will carry on for a number of months as this stuff works its way through the various supply chains. So I don't think, even if Trump wanted to lean on Zelensky, I don't necessarily think he will. he's not going to have that much leverage for several months, because Ukraine is not going to be starved of weapons in the way it was in 2023 for a period of 6 to 8 months. And so there's not that leverage there. Putin is going to want to draw this out for as long as possible to get as much advantage as he can. He's going to want to throw as many North Korean troops in there as he possibly can. It's going to be way, way more than the 10,000 that were initially announced. That to me was obvious from day one. You wouldn't just do this with a symbolic number. You'd have a continuous supply of those. That's happening. They are turning out to be as pretty hopeless as everyone expected. And it seems that the North Koreans and Russians can't really communicate too well together, which of course is not advantageous in a military situation. But I think there are so many things. I mean, one of the things that Biden could do, I don't think he'll be able to manage it. He doesn't directly control it, but he is currently putting pressure on European allies to release the full $300 billion of Russian sovereign assets, central bank assets. That could make an enormous difference. But also there are people in Trump's circle, clearly the pro-Ukraine, is thinking, okay, this guy's very transactional. He's always going to be framing what's in it for me. Why should I bump it up my list of priorities? And as Dr. Gerdes said, what's in it for him is one of the surest ways to bump it up his to-do list. So they've started talking about the, I think, $11 trillion dollars of minerals, rare earth minerals, assets, etc., in the ground in Ukraine. That's smart. When you add that, the weapons, the weaponry that needs to be bought, and of course the investment in Ukraine's military defense infrastructure, and sell it to Trump on the idea that, look, you can beat up NATO without destroying it, and you can force Europeans to go up to 3% GDP. Actually, I'm going to do a video on that one, the 3% solution. I think we're going to be starting to hear a lot more about 3% being the threshold. Someone's going to put a spreadsheet in front of him, or a simplified spreadsheet, and say, look, these are the jobs that could bring. 3% GDP, you get Europeans to pay this. Oh my goodness, that is the best bragging rights you could ever have. And by the way, this is how that's going to translate into money for the US economy. So I think that could be turned into a kind of win-win.
One of the things that I would just say militarily, because you guys know I spend a lot of time on the front there, we have a couple of key locations that we need support in right now that would allow this patience factor, this time factor. I'm thinking specifically of places like Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, the continual support and of our troops that are on Russian sovereign territory in the Kursk Oblast. All of these things that are happening are very needed steps for Ukraine to solidify its position militarily going into 2025, to continue this perspective of the Europeans or the Americans saying, okay, we can do this. We can do this. Let's stand with these guys. Let's support these guys. So in lieu of all of these, large scale conversations right now for this audience, I would just remind you to continue to think about those guys fighting right now. This war, it's a very real war. And just south of Pokrovsk, and that's in the southern part of Ukraine, if you do not know. Toretsk is in dire straits. Kharkov was about 80% occupied. Chasiv Yar, there's a renewed assault on that, on the bank down the hill from Konstantinivka. And then, of course, the Kupiansk area and the Kursk area, and the continued daily assault of civilians on Kherson. We need to really focus on these areas, help Ukraine focus, battle, stand strong in these areas, and allow that as a part of the patience factor to come through. I'm just believing for a big swell in the beginning of 2025, and Ukraine actually begins to take some of their territory back. That's what I'm believing for. We're already hearing chats of that inside Kyiv on some potential counteroffensive. We haven't heard that word in a long time, but if you take that counteroffensive word and you put that into the equation, that gives Trump, the administration, European leaders more to think about. Is we're not just backing up, but we're making advancement here. So these are all things. And then you can throw into that the fall of Syria, the logistical hub for Russia there in the Middle East. Now their pipeline is broken a little bit with their nonstop running back and forth to their operations in Africa and their raping of the African continent. So there's a lot of things at play right now, and it's almost as if, okay, world, we actually may have Putin on the back heel here. Let's put some pressure down. And right now, standing with Ukraine, supplying as hard as we can over these next couple of months, and assisting those guys to hold the line and even push the line will be key going forward into the new administration and new European leaders and where we end up in 2025.
So Greg, you mentioned Syria, and I mean, what great timing from the Ukrainian perspective, this thing with Syria. Like, it could only be better if it was like a month from now, just before Trump took office, but still great timing. And I can't tell whether it's more of a financial, logistical, or prestige disaster, or military disaster for Putin. I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are, because to my mind, the prestige factor is the greatest, and like Putin just really lost a lot of prestige by losing what he lost in Syria, because he's always been back there, the backstop for Assad, and it showed how hollow that was. What do you all think?
Well, it's the
It goes back
prestige
to what you.
Yeah, I think it's the prestige factor, but it's also a lot of the money factor, because Putin invested billions of dollars over the years into Syria. And now all of that money is just going down the drain because, of course, he needs to evacuate all of his personnel. He needs to evacuate all of his bases also. The Assad regime fell, and it fell really quickly. So that means that all of that money that he invested is just going nowhere.
Well, it's multiple things, but like, which was the worst? I think it's prestige, man.
It's the prestige, and it's his it's his standing in the world, because now the card house is basically falling. It's like Georgia is not going to according to plan. Romania is not going to according to plan. And Romania, I think, is the most surprising one of them all. And I'm very proud of them, because it's kind of like the foreign interference a situation in the Foreign Interference Act. I'm surprised they implemented that. And that's a big deal, because that sets precedent for other countries like Georgia. And that sets precedent for like other things that are going to be happening worldwide. And his grip is just loosening. And I think that's also one of the good things, is that, even if there is doubt on what Trump's idea or what Trump's alliance is going to be like in this war, it's a really great time for Ukraine, because this is a sort of time where we can defeat Russia by simply just pushing Russia further. Because it's kind of like either we wait them out and they die, or they wait us out and we die. This is the type of situation we're in here. And I think that what Zelensky is doing with sort of like, pardon my French, kissing Trump's ass and offering him minerals and all of these things about Ukraine is good, because he's kind of showing him like, hey, maybe if you had some sort of agreements with Russia or some sort of business with Russia or something, here's what we can offer you. Those guys, they're clearly not having a good time, and they're falling, and they're going to keep falling. However, we can offer you all of this on our territory. You can make money off of it. You can make investments off of it. And we're also not going to hold it over your head like they do.
And
so I think
there's
that's
so
kind of
many
where we're
angles, I
at
think,
with it.
where this is.
Yeah.
There's so many angles where this is important. And of course, Putin, there's a big chunk of his population who probably don't care one way or the other, and don't think too much about how much of their sovereign wealth has been wasted. But there is a portion of the population, it's estimated anywhere between sort of 15 and 25%, and that is the Z patriots. They're spitting feathers. They are so pissed at this. They are so upset. To the point where I think some of them are kind of going off script with this, which is kind of interesting. That's where I think we need to watch, is where the Z patriots go off script. That's when there's a kind of real problem.
Well,
but the other angle, and this is one for you two, which is Trump, no matter his detractors, which I count myself one, will point out his numerous bankruptcies and all this kind of stuff. And espousing values on the one hand, and yet clearly not living up to those values. That's kind of one thing. Let's park that for a minute. Trump does not respect weakness. He seems to respect strength. I think we've often, on the other side, we've confused his respect for Putin and his power as being subservient to Putin. No, but I think he does respect sort of strength. He does respect people who can click their fingers and make things happen, and people follow, and I can sort of see why that would appeal with his sort of business mindset as opposed to political mindset. Putin is starting to look like a loser. He's lost in Syria. He's losing in Georgia. He's resorting to brutish tactics. He's clearly not won over Moldova. He's not winning in Romania, which it just blew me away what they've done there. Serbia now have popular protests on the streets against the Russian-centric government there, and there are many other examples. Armenia is breaking away from the Moscow-led security alliance, and there's a lot of disquiet in Central Asian states, pushback against Moscow in various ways, various degrees. He's beginning to look like a loser. I mean, if this message can be exacerbated, and I think Trump sees it because I think he extensively understands strength and weakness in that fashion. But if we can build on that, he may not want to put his own political capital, risk his own personal capital in someone like Putin, who is on a fast track to losing, I think, spectacularly. It is said that Putin carries a picture of Gaddafi, not pre-ditch, post-ditch picture of the corpse of Gaddafi, carries that around or has that on his desk. I think that is his worst case scenario, but all of his actions are making this end of his own story, I think, far more likely.
The prestige factor, I think, then is what I'm hearing the three of us are basically agreeing on, especially in regard to Syria with the other factors in play. I can tell you, I was watching some video of Russians evacuating Syria, and it was, I will be honest, a massive amount of equipment and a massive amount of convoys. It's coming out of Syria. Where is it going? I don't know. No need to speculate on that right now. But the fact is, as they were leaving, the Syrians there from the different factions are standing up on the side of the road and they're shaking their shoes at the Russian army and they're cursing them in their native language and saying, "Get out of our country, get out of our country." And then overnight tonight, or last night, Israel strikes Tartus with an airstrike, blowing up weapons depots and munitions. And for the most part, we're hearing silence. It's not on mainstream media. It's not out there. Nobody's really talking about it. But the prestige factor is going away. And then put on top of that, we welcome the evil dictator Assad to Moscow, and we'll take care of you. We're going to encircle you and take care of you. I believe that these things in the long play will be beneficial for Ukraine
Yeah.
as
Mhm.
that prestige factor falls for the allies of Russia and Putin, as you were so eloquently stating, Jonathan.
And couple that, Greg, with what Ukraine did by supplying the 20 special operators and a few hundred drones, which isn't a lot, but they were working with those people that are now the victors. And couple that with that Ukraine is going to be sending some grain to
Yes, sir.
Syria, right? I mean, so that reciprocity factor is working a virtuous circle now for Ukraine and Syrian relations, and that'll work well. Where it's not just that Russia's evil and bad and did these things to you, but we're doing these good things to you. So, yeah.
Ukraine in
Yeah.
general is building a lot of new connections, like Ukraine and South Korea. And South Korea is normally a partner to no one. They're just kind of like on the side of the world. They're dealing with North Korea, right? And like, I mean, they are a Western ally, but they don't necessarily have like tight alliances like that. And Ukraine is changing that. Then Ukraine is changing that with Syria. And I think we're making like all the right friends in the right places. I think that a good sort of conclusion to this conversation is that many people are worried, and I said this before, right? I just sort of want to summarize it, and I think that we all agree on this, right? Is that many people are worried that when Trump comes to power, it's going to be like a quick resolution. And I guess like some people are hoping that it's going to be like a month and Ukraine wins, and some people are like, oh yeah, Ukraine, and some people are afraid that it's going to be like a month or two and Ukraine loses, right? I think that's such a huge misconception, and none of that is going to happen. We're going to see the war lasting well through 2025. I mean, Zelensky is optimistic that it might end in 2025. I'm not so sure unless they have some aces of spades under their sleeve, or they know something about sanctioning Russia that we don't, right? Or they know something political that we don't, like, more situations like Syria unfolding, for instance. But in general, I think that the pressure on Russia is going to be more economic, and once Russia crush us economically, then there is going to be some military action from Ukraine, and then it is likely going to be a negotiating table, but not in a way that people are used to saying it, where they're like, oh, Ukraine needs to negotiate, right? It's not that Ukraine needs to negotiate. I think that Ukraine is going to force Russia to negotiate. And I think that's the goal, sort of. But that's not going to be happening, within a month or two or something of Trump coming into office. I think that Trump honestly has very little impact on what happens in general. I guess
We're all waiting for the other not to, not to step on them. No, I think that you're right. It certainly won't wrap up in 2024. It might not wrap up in 2025. I don't think that this idea that it's going to just wrap up right away is valid in any way, shape, or form. And I think my colleagues here would agree.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
I think we're looking deep into 2025, even initially. I just think there are many things, and Yulia, to your statement, there are many things in the pipeline that maybe publicly none of us are aware of yet, but those in the know are aware of. Maybe there are some other shoes to drop in Russian activity around the world? I don't know. But here's what I do know. Ukraine is fighting a just war, and Ukraine is fighting for their nation. They're fighting for their truth of we are people of goodness. We are people of care. We are people of sovereignty. And they're fighting for what is right. And I believe as day by day by day goes, and we see the prestige fall on that Russian empire, we can call it, that horrible leftover mess of the Soviet Union led by Vladimir Putin. I just believe there will be further coalition building for Ukraine, and the time is right now to take this evil empire out once and for all. So that's what I'm optimistic about going into 2025. We just need to support the Ukrainians battling right now. It is so key that they hold these positions and even have the possibilities to take some territory back. I can tell you the Defense Ministry of Russia, I watched that entire thing, as I said earlier, they were doing their big end of the year report, and they're just touting how much land they're taking every day, how their mobilization is going, how many weapons they're making. The world needs to listen to that, and we need to support and stand with Ukraine. And I believe we will. And I'm standing for victory all the way.
And to that point, there's nothing there to disagree with at all. I think it's incredibly cogent. Just as as Dr. Gerdes says, we need to get away from the idea that this is just going to be over, because Ukraine managed to push Russia back from Kiev without a huge cache of Western weapons. It had a few bits and bobs here, but it was largely with their own strength, willpower, and their own caches of weapons. So this cannot end in that way. But also, Putin's not going to suddenly wake up one day and go, do you know what? This has all been a bit of a mistake. Let's kind of roll it back. He's not going to do that. He is in this, I think, until he pops his clogs. What we should expect to see, I think, is a gradual realization through 2025 that Western nations, if they are of goodwill and value security, freedom, and so on, as Ukrainians do, we're going to have to behave much more like Ukraine. We're going to have to tackle Russia wherever that sort of snake-like hydra head pops up. And if by lopping it off, 10 more little ones grow, well, you're going to have to lop them off too. Because I think we're going to see a lot more gray zone warfare, a lot more sabotage, a lot more assassination. You're going to see ecological catastrophes like the one unfolding over the weekend with the 2 Russian oil tankers that broke in half on the Black Sea. You're going to see the disastrous, toxic tentacles of Russian Soviet imperialism all over the world. And rather than just letting it grow unchecked like some kind of vicious knotweed, we're going to have to start sort of, getting the old DDT or whatever out and just pushing it back behind its borders. In that respect, Ukraine's shown us the way, not just on the territory of Europe, but also by tackling Wagner, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, also by apparently training some of these Syrian rebels in drone warfare. We're all going to be a little bit more Ukrainian, I think, by the end of 2025, and the Putin empire will be in abeyance.
I agree with that. I think
Beautifully stated, Jonathan.
Yeah, I don't think any one of us is as eloquent as Jonathan is. It's like we all speak and then Jonathan wraps it in a very nice little English bow. Well, thank you so much, guys, for being here today and for sharing your opinions and for this brilliant discussion. Also, thank you for joining us last minute, Professor Gerdes. That was one of the nicest surprises for Christmas.
No, glad to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you, guys.
Yulia. Thank you for all you
Thank
do. We stand
thank
with
you
you
so
guys.
much. And I'm excited to see you here soon again.
I'll be there in just a couple of weeks. See you soon.
See you soon.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Slava. Well, hopefully you found this conversation as inspiring as I did and enjoyed this panel, because I sure did. We never had as many speakers as today. If you found this conversation, I don't know, educational, inspiring, interesting, please don't forget to follow this channel. Also, subscribe to our notifications so you don't miss the next conversations. And of course, give this video a like and send it to a friend, because you never know who might find them interesting. And leave your questions, suggestions, constructive criticism in the comments, because I read all of it and it truly helps me tailor next episodes to what your interests are. See you next time.